Good morning. So thanks for joining us this morning. Welcome to the longest titled session, I think, out of this entire event. This is Moneyball, Music and Commerce, digging into the stats, what Facebook, mobile technology, YouTube, Spotify, Twitter, Pandora, Rdio, social media, charting, ticketing, and other stats mean. So now that we're 100% clear on what we're all talking about, I think we'll get into this. So thanks for joining us again. There's a lot going on, obviously, in the digital music space. This is a wonderful group of experts here that come from a variety of backgrounds, represent a variety of different companies. So I think there's lots to learn this morning, and hopefully we'll keep you here engaged. Just from a structure standpoint, we'll be going through a variety of questions and talking to you guys about some current trending topics, but we will open this up for Q&A towards the back end. So if there's anything you feel like we have not covered that you'd like to ask, we're certainly willing to take your questions towards the end. So I think we'll start with some brief introductions just so you have an understanding of everyone who's up here and what our backgrounds are. I'll quickly just explain my background. My name's Dean Serletic. I'm the head of marketing and licensing at Zaya, which is a music tech company based not too far up the street here in Calabasas. My background is I've been in the music business for 20 years, owned record label, publishing company, artist management, etc. I've done both the music business as an independent entrepreneur as well as going in and working at major labels such as Virgin Records. Started Zaya about 5 years ago, really to help change the way people interact with music and give fun new experiences both in the games and messaging space. And I'll go ahead and pass down here. Let's start with Cheryl.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Lucanegro, and I'm the VP of Advertising Strategy and Sales over at SoundHound, which is all about, we're about monetization. That's my role within the organization. For those of you who don't, can you hear? Sorry about that. For those of you who don't know SoundHound, and I'm hoping a lot of you do, we are that first entry point of when you discover music. So if you hear something playing in the car, on the radio, you hear something playing on a TV commercial, you hear something at a live event, you press the SoundHound button and it actually will give you that accurate result. What differentiates us between us and other competitors in the market is you can actually sing and hum that song. So a lot of music slips away. If it isn't already playing, we actually can identify it by that and by talking and a number of other things. So we're that entry point, and we actually work with all the streaming services because we provide, if you found that song that you fell in love with and you were trying to identify it, we then can actually start a station on any of the streaming services that are out there. That's just a little background on SoundHound.
Good morning, Michael Drexler. I'm the executive director at BMI, looking after digital licensing business development. So BMI is one of the 3 performing rights organizations, or PROs. There's ASCAP and CSAC, and now GMR, which is a very small one. We license our catalog of 8.5 million songs, specifically the public performance of it, to a variety of businesses. And, digital obviously is a big part of it, and it's where the growth is coming from for us. So our clients sit on this, most of them, some of them are here with me on the panel. We have about 10,000 digital, platform clients from large to small. We make it easy, or try to make it easy, to get a blanket license in place, so you don't have to worry about, getting hit with a lawsuit from one of our publishers. That's really the value we're providing. Before BMI, I was at Sony Music looking after corporate development and business development in their global digital business group. We also work with Gracenote and some digital distribution companies. And in my former life, I had a career as a producer, engineer, so really sort of been in music my whole life.
I'm Ethan Kaplan. I'm a general manager and SVP of music at Gracenote. Gracenote powers things like iTunes Radio. We also have recognition engines and a good metadata store. We're basically the back-end tech for a lot of the music services as well as music technologies out there, including things like Samsung TV. I'm new to the role. I just started 4 weeks ago. So before that, I was co-founded Live Nation Labs, which was a technology incubator at Live Nation. We made the Live Nation app and website. And before that, I was head of technology over at Warner Brothers Records and at Warner Music Group.
Hi, my name is Jason Feinberg. I am head of artist marketing at Pandora. If I'm familiar, we are the largest internet radio service. My focus within artist marketing is a platform that provides analytics and other tools to artists to essentially harness all the listeners and the consumption happening on Pandora. My background is essentially software development and record labels, so it's been a lovely mashup of those two things. I ran digital at a number of different record labels, most recently Epitaph Records, and before that, Concord Music Group.
My name is Mark Ruxin. I'm the CMO at Rdio. For people that don't know Rdio, it's one of the biggest streaming companies in the world. We have a subscription-based business, and we have a free ad-supported model. I joined about 9 months ago. Rdio bought my company, Tastemaker X, which was a music discovery platform. Prior to that, I was the chief digital guy at Interpublic, so McCann Erickson and Universal McCann. So I'm a reformed ad guy, but a lifelong music nerd. So I'm happy to be where I am.
So Mark, we'll maybe start with you and kind of talk about, sorry, make sure this is on here. So Mark, we'll maybe keep it with you for a second here. You know, knowing the streaming service space and what's going on there, obviously the big looming giant with Apple and everyone anxious to see how they're going to enter the space, what recently has happened with Tidal and maybe the rocky start that they've gotten off to. What's your expectation as far as how much room is there in this space for competition? And when something like Tidal launches and you see their marketing plan, and what it did well and what it didn't do well, how do you look to distinguish yourself against all the music streaming services out there? And how important is it for fans of music to understand what's unique about Rdio versus those other services?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions there. So I think I'll answer the ones that that I feel like. I think. So I'll start with so I'm a music fan, and I think if you think about what streaming represents, the 14-year-old version of myself, would have been, a pig in shit with a streaming service model today. So I spent my entire allowance on recorded music for, I don't know, the first 45 years of my life, and maybe the first 40, because for the past 5 years, I don't think ownership is necessarily relevant. When you think about all the distribution points in music 20 years ago, there were record stores, there were distributors, there were lots of companies in the space. I think when you apply the opportunity, across a global audience, and we're pretty much kind of Western Europe and US focused right now, there's 3 billion connected devices on the planet. There's 35 million songs that you can access on Rdio. I think there's room for a lot of players. And I don't think, again, there's no label folks on the panel, but for label folks, I think you want more than just 3 customers. So I don't think it's good for labels to have Apple, Amazon, and Google be the distributors of all music across every format. So I think people that love music will pick the platform that they appreciate the most. So Rdio really started from a place of super simple, clean software design. It was really designed for music lovers and people that appreciate software. So the difference in a lot of cases is just the UI and our emphasis on artists and albums and not just kind of social aspects. So I think sure, Apple's they've got a massive global footprint. I don't think they've ever really nailed the user experience, both from a social perspective and from a discovery perspective. So I'll be curious to see what they do. I think, rising tides raise all boats in this space. When you look at what streaming represents, for less than the cost of downloading one album or, for half the cost of buying a CD, you can have access to, basically the entire history of recorded music. So, again, I think that message needs to be more broadly distributed. I think there's room for a whole bunch of streaming video content platforms. And I think there's room for, a dozen strong global, distributors of radio and subscription-based music. So, again, I think they'll help purify the message that most consumers don't yet understand.
Great. Appreciate that. Just one follow-up question. Do you think a free tier for your service is essential for your business to continue to grow?
We think about free a little bit differently than some of the competitors. So, we think about free as ad-supported radio with a bunch of different flavors. And I think, I think industry standard is about 25% of free users upgrade to paid. And I don't think for people that aren't paying for music or haven't paid for music for a while, for us, it's inexpensive onboarding to get people on a subscription. So I think it's critical. But I think, the economics have to work for artists. I think artists should, have a choice of where and kind of how they distribute their music. So we're not in the business of telling artists they can only be on one tier of our service. So for us, it's critical. I mean, I think to go from, not paying for music to committing to $10 a month is hard. But I think once you get used to, listening to music over IP, over, a variety of different devices, it's natural that some percentage of those people will upgrade.
Right. And look, music discovery has always been critical, right? That's for all of us, in the music business, and from a label owner and publisher standpoint, we need ways for people to discover music, and a lot of what you guys are offering on this panel are opportunities to do so. And Cheryl, I want to kind of lob something your way of, we see through data that the #1 discovery service by far, certainly among teens, is YouTube. That's where most music discovery is happening and throughout that age group. Where do you guys see from SoundHound, from use with your service? What are the platforms? Where are people finding and using your service to discover music?
Well, I think it's a matter of education. And if you think about the younger generation, in particular, millennials and younger young adults, their expectation is that if I use my phone or any mobile device, that if I just press a button or talk to it, I will get an answer. Versus an older generation is a little more like, they'll type in the name of an artist, they'll go through Google search, they'll do a number of other things. But what we've found is the demographics of people hearing something for the first time, not in YouTube, because YouTube is more of a practice where you're going in, you're looking, or your friends have shared information with you. So you're on a mission. But that serendipitous, when all of a sudden you hear something in a commercial and you go, what is that song? You're watching Girls and a song comes on the show that you've never heard before, or maybe it's part of your memory and you forgot about it, by just pressing a button and getting an answer. That discovery mode makes you, in some cases, a fan, because you've leaned in. And for music labels, for artists, I think it's that real opportunity that if that song is there, they can hear a snippet of it, they can buy it, or they can immediately start a radio station, a Beats radio station, a Pandora station, a Spotify station. All of a sudden it becomes more and more part of who they are, and that song, they become a fan. So we found that the content we provide too, that allows them to go deeper and explore, sort of creates a discovery mode that's very different than what YouTube is. So I think we're a complement to YouTube. I think we're a complement to all the streaming services. But I think we are that first entry point of discovery.
Great. Jason, I know we were talking earlier before the panel about how you help artists, and kind of your role at Pandora is to provide tools to the artist community. Can you talk a bit about what are the tools that are most important right now? What sets the sites that a hit record is emerging on Pandora? How do you know a new artist is gaining traction, and how can you help that artist and that label understand those events and have the tools to fuel the fire?
Sure. So there's a lot to that. I'll try to keep it succinct. So far, we launched an artist marketing platform in October, and the first product of that is Insights, an analytics and metrics tool. And that's the first big swing, was essentially providing a tremendous amount of data about an artist and their songs, their listeners. And that's a really valuable tool if you know what to do with it. And this is a challenge that I think every single person in this industry, regardless if you're an artist, the artists themselves, the management, the label, whoever you are, trying to make sense of all the data out there is a tremendous feat. I think back to my record label days, and that's a lot of what I focused on, right? Running campaigns for artists. We'd have tremendous amounts of data coming in from every provider in various degrees. And it's one thing to be informed about what's previously happened. It's another thing to use this data to create actionable insights and to really do something with it. And it's sort of, in my discipline anyway, kind of the holy grail. Like if you can crack the code on how to turn raw data into true actionable intelligence, you really have something. So we're doing our best to make a contribution to that. I mean, we have over 80 million monthly users on Pandora, over 250 million registered. So that's creating a tremendous amount of data. At this point, we have over 50 billion, with a B, pieces of thumb feedback, thumbs up, thumbs down, what people like, in context, out of context. So we're trying to provide this to an artist in a useful way. So we're showing them listener data, right? Locations, where they are in the country, marrying that to percentage of spin. So who's hearing their music in what part of the country. We break it down by radio DMAs so that if it's someone at a label who is running a radio campaign, it speaks their language and it can translate. It can be ammunition to help get additional interest. We're providing detailed information on actual songs. So how many times it was spun, the thumbs up percentage so they can get a sense of fan affinity for that song. We're providing timelines as far as when different events occurs, listener spikes, things like that. And then the goal of all this is provide them action, right? So we're having artists use this data to impact how they're plotting tours. We've had stories of artists coming to us saying, we had a show booked in New York or an East Coast tour, and we were selling terribly, hardly any tickets. We looked at your data and we realized that our listeners, the ones most actively engaged, were in a complete other part of the country. Changed our tour routing, started selling tickets. Now, we don't exist in a vacuum, and of course, there's other platforms and other data that should inspire those decisions. But the point is, if you don't understand where your fans are and what their behaviors are, you may be making wrong decisions. And we're seeing that with a lot of the data we're providing. People changing set lists, greatest hits compilations, playlists, just better understanding of how to speak to their audience, how to advertise more effectively. So that's the primary tool we currently have, but we're also looking to develop, and we're in the pilot stage of a few additional tools that are much more actionable. We've rolled out a pilot program recently called Artist Audio Messaging. And the premise of this, imagine a radio drop. Hey, this is Artist X, and you're listening to my station. Or you're listening to, thanks for listening to my music. You hear that on terrestrial radio all the time, but there's no call to action. We're marrying up the ability to drive that attention somewhere. So it's now, hey, this is Artist X. You just heard my new single off my album, whatever. Tap your screen to buy it now. So we're giving artists a path to create real revenue off of the exposure on Pandora. And of course, that's leads to a revenue chain to many people in the mix. So those are the types of tools we're looking at. There's more that we're building. I guess stay tuned for those. But really the headline here is, this platform launched a few months ago, and it's really day one of this large effort to give marketing and revenue driver tools to the entire artist community.
And when you say artist community, who are your partners that you mainly work with on Insights? Is that record labels, or how much of the kind of management and artist community are you working with directly?
So, I mean, really, we look at it as the music maker community at the end of the day, and this is everyone in that chain. So you have the artists, you have the managers, you have the different rights holders, whether it's the label, the publishers. There's so many people that this impacts, as really any any type of music consumption should. As far as my immediate focus, it's really artists and managers primarily. The way we've launched is a focus on artist by artist proprietary data. So as the artist, the manager, or a licensed representative, so to speak, one that the artist has given authentication, such as Twitter credentials, something like that, you're able to log in, claim that artist's data and access to the profile, which will continue to unlock those other tools I mentioned. So at the moment, it's really artist by artist, and that's partly just how we're structured in general, just the nature of Pandora, how we acquire and play content, and it's also just a very clean way to start rolling these tools out and really understand the impact they're having to the community.
Okay, great. Ethan, I know obviously with Grace Note, you guys stand in the middle of so much of what's going on as being kind of the power behind so many of these services. Can you speak to what trends and emerging opportunities you see in this digital music space?
Yeah, I think we're at an interesting juncture, and kind of hits on like June 8th at WWDC, where the biggest the biggest company in digital music space is going to start switching to a subscription model, which changes the entire relationship that not only consumers have with music itself, but how people market music changes music from being a funnel-based breakage model where you're trying to, drive toward a download or a CD purchase, into one that's about recurring revenue and recurring spins and recurring hits and recurring attention. And that's a very different world when Madonna's 300,000 first week or whatever it was is now 300,000 spins, and she needs 300,000 spins the next week and 300,000 the week after and a year after in order to maintain that revenue stream. So when you're talking about the biggest player in the space going, which like Mark said, it starts opening up, I think, the opportunity for everybody else to differentiate in new and interesting ways, whether it's design, software curation, et cetera. That's a big change. The industry's never prepped themselves for that. If you go to a marketing meeting at a label, it is still about radio spins and unit sales at the end of the day. And they still push for a pre-sale pop on iTunes in order to get their chart position, screenshot the chart, send it out to the radio PDs in order to tell a good story. And it's still very story-based, not very data-based. There's not a lot of people in the big data space on music anymore. Music Metrics sold to Apple, Big Champagne sold to Live Nation. Next Big Sound is the only really remaining one out there as an aggregator. And it's still mostly focused around social rather than sales. The two that were focused around sales are gone, basically shut down. So there's not a lot of market intelligence. We're in a world where the music consumer is going to start being viewed similarly to how any subscription-based SaaS service views people. It's churn and lifetime value and average revenue per user, rather than just they bought a CD and if they never play it, it still counts as revenue on our books. So that change is fascinating. I think it's going to be exciting. It's going to be terrifying at a Wednesday marketing meeting at a Warner's or a Capitol. And I think that the week after the switchover from Apple, we'll see a very different kind of picture of how people view success.
Yeah, and I think terrestrial radio still plays such a big role in breaking an artist and developing an artist, right? And speaking to your point, that it is about radio spins at most major labels. That's the starting point and the driving point, right?
Well, and the starting point is telling a good story to the PDs at the stations in order to get the spins. And stories are kind of stories. They're narrative generated. They're not necessarily factually generated sometimes. So there's still a lot of emotional aspects that go behind how to get music out there. There's not a lot of quantification from that, what makes something cross to pop, for instance, which is, a huge mix of a lot of stuff that tells a good story to a PD. When that stuff starts getting informed by data, if terrestrial starts losing its ability to drive pop and urban and rock music, to an extent, rock, not as much, that'll transition the other side of it as well.
Yeah. I mean, are there tools, or what stats do you think are most important? Because, the conversation with program directors, unfortunately, is pretty quick conversation, right? It's typically about spins and what you're doing in other markets and how you're rising the charts. Unit sales, frankly, has been a tough conversation with them throughout the years. They don't even understand unit sales. So what data can they start, do you think program directors can start understanding, or is most important for them to start understanding to change their ways? Because
it's kind of like the big push in the label side for the last 10 years since I've been in the system is basically, how do we know our fans better in order to know where they are, who they are, what they want? A lot of the radio stations, as they consolidated in their revenue picture changes, are looking for more impact from whatever they put out there, because they're still advertising supported in the end. So whatever data about the demographics that's not as loose as maybe NPD, but something more quantified, that actually helps the picture a lot. That's why Big Champagne was actually sold a lot to radio stations on one hand and labels on the other, because it kind of met in the middle in terms of correlative data on what people's tastes were based on something that the labels were still trying to shut down, file sharing. And then that later, brought in itself to YouTube and iTunes. And so, it becomes just what it's always been. How do we know the fans better? And that relationship between the artist and the fans and the label and the fans, and those relationships that existed between all these different transaction points starts mattering a lot more. And everybody's been chasing that for a while now.
Could I add something?
Yep.
The one thing that I think is really interesting is radio stations, to keep relevant with younger audiences in particular, have got to be looking at what people are streaming. They have to be looking, for example, at what people are actually sound hounding or IDing to find out more about, because it keeps them relevant. A lot of the songs take a while to get on radio. They don't automatically every song doesn't get on radio instantly. And it's been streaming. We've seen charts when I was at Pandora, as well as we're here at SoundHound, where there's emerging artists that are our top songs that have been ID'd or turned into, or tried to turn into stations at other streaming services way before it even hits a Billboard list at all. So I think they have to start looking at this data a lot more to really stay relevant within younger audiences.
All right, at SoundHound, how are you guys distributing that information to labels, artists, and managers?
Legally, depending on what we're doing with licensing, we basically have feeds every week where we provide new songs. There's a number of things we do, providing data to labels, to managers. At the same time, we also create charts. So we have something called an emerging chart, which is a chart of songs that you probably don't know that well, but they're trending, for example, in London, or they're trending in various parts of the world, and all of a sudden it's a brand new song. So those things are available. We provide the data to the labels when asked.
Right.
Or when we're working with them through licensing.
Right. So Michael, you guys sit in the middle of all this with BMI, right? There's not anyone up here that basically launches a service without working with you guys and making sure that we have access to your wonderful catalog.
That's the whole, yes.
Right, exactly. You're right. Sometimes it doesn't happen.
Right.
There's a lot of call for licensing reform right now, right? And, I think Irving putting his toe in the water and doing what he's doing with GMR is a testament to that. What concerns you the most right now as far as, licensing reform topics and what's going on in this marketplace?
Yeah, sure. So just taking a step back again. So BMI is one of the 3, now 4 PROs. We're licensing the public performance rights. So typically our licenses are a blanket license that covers the entire service. And I would argue that our license is probably the easiest one to get for any service among the other sort of permissions they need, for example, from the record labels or mechanicals from the publishers. But it's interesting in the marketplace. There are certain rights that are regulated and certain other rights are freely negotiated. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect, right? So the PROs, the performing rights organizations, are historically regulated. We have a consent decree, which is a contract with the Department of Justice, that basically restricts us from what we can and can't do. And that's actually great for the licensees because, for example, we're now allowed to discriminate, which is sort of a built-in MFN between, let's say, streaming services that come to us for license. We don't have the ability to say no to anybody. So it's you come to, you ask us for a license, we have to give it to you essentially. And as part of that, our leverage is sort of low because, if you can't say no, if you can imagine, people already have access to your catalog, your leverage to negotiate a license agreement is small. Let's put it this way. So we're sort of in a sort of weakened position. So there's been a couple of initiatives. There is a copyright reform proposal from the Copyright Office in DC. It's a wonderful 250-page read. If you're hanging out at the pool later, I can only recommend it. So, a couple of key things in there, for example, asking for a performance right for master sound recordings in terrestrial radio, which surprisingly, if you didn't know this, but USA is the only country in the world where there's no public performance in sound recordings because terrestrial radio is still viewed as sort of a promotional channel. Whereas, Pandora and other internet radio stations have to pay a fee to record labels for the public performance of their master recording. So there's a little bit of a disequilibrium, if you will. The other things like, publishers are asking to partially withdraw from digital rights and overall trying to, relax the consent decree a little bit and to move into an area where we have less regulation rather than more regulation and where we arrive, as willing buyers and willing sellers at licenses that benefit both the creators and the service providers. Now, in terms of GMR, they're sort of a new entrant, and you may have heard of Irving Azoff was threatened to sue YouTube and everybody else, and basically convinced a couple of songwriters to go with him to his new company called Global Music Rights. The jury's still out on that. I think it's very sort of fresh in the marketplace. From BMI's perspective, writers have historically always moved between PROs. So whether it's from ASCAP to BMI to CSAC or whatever, that's really nothing new. But there is a potential, fourth entrant now in the PRO market.
Yeah, it's interesting. At a time when Spotify and Taylor Swift removing her content from that service was making news, Irving tried to change the conversation and focus everyone on YouTube, and from a free-based service, wanted to make sure and make the point that, addressing models like Spotify, where there's at least a way to convert somebody into paid, there's an opportunity to earn greater revenue there. But services like YouTube, really do not offer any type of monetization beyond the initial license, which is, as Irving's pointing out, a very small amount of money.
Well, they're trying now with Music Key.
Right, exactly.
That's a new product, but who knows? I haven't spent much time with it.
Do you agree with his Irving's point of view, though, that the reform is really needed for YouTube and their licensing rights?
What I just mentioned is sort of the leverage that these rights organizations have could be higher, and I agree with them in that the ability to say no is obviously a huge benefit. If you can, like Taylor Swift, if you can take down your catalog, if you choose to do so, you should be free to do so if you don't agree with the business model. I mean, in Taylor's case, I think she was happy with the subscription model overall. She just didn't like the monetization on the free tier, and it just in her mind or in her manager's mind didn't lead to enough conversions and subscriptions. But I can see his point. I think the way he's going about it is it's aggressive, but it's a voice out there.
Right.
I mean, just that point. I don't know if my mic's working. I think it's unfair to the streaming services who are really doing their best to make sure artists get paid, because if artists can't leverage the global scale that platforms such as Rdio and Spotify and others provide, a lot less artists are going to be able to make a living making music, and if they can't make a living making music, there'll be a lot less music. So I mean, we come from that place, and I think having SoundCloud and YouTube as a pretty darn good free option really disrupts the opportunity for artists to leverage a long tail audience of younger people. So it really inequitably biases those platforms against folks that are really focused on creating sustainable revenue for artists. So I think there does need to be reform, and not just for the streaming services towards on the onward march toward profitability. I think it really is about creating the opportunity for artists to make a living. And right now it's viewed as promotion. And I think from a label perspective, you can justify that. But from an artist perspective, if 90% of consumption happens on free platforms, at some point in time, you're going to concede defeat and not be able to sustain yourself. So.
And do you worry, because ultimately for all of us that have kids, any teenagers or younger in the house, they turn to YouTube. That's their number one source for music discovery. Changing that habit with this generation to paying for music, how do you address that?
Well, I mean, I think there's a kind of a strange hypocrisy, at least in this country. I don't know if the dynamics are similar everywhere, but people are fine to pay $8 to Netflix and $15 to HBO and $140 a year for Amazon Prime for some percentage of some catalog, some of the time on some devices. For whatever reason, the paradigm that for $10 a month, you can literally have the history of recorded music. I mean, again, that's a marketing, we were talking about this before. That's a marketing problem. And I think from Rhapsody to today, and everybody on this panel is like partially guilty in some way. And there's a bunch of folks that aren't in this panel that are also guilty. But part of it is, I think, music in this context is a patronage model to some extent. I also think that you can't listen to albums, that you can't listen to specific songs. I think there's a lot of education that we need to do. And I think, I know we live in an attention kind of deprived society, and people have 3.5-minute attention spans. But I think part of, our goal as an industry, and part of, I think our obligation to kids is to have them dig more deeply into content. And I think that will never be accessible on platforms like that. So, I think the ubiquity of a 35 million song global catalog is super important. And I think, putting certain constraints on that, doing a lot more education on, what an album means, or what it means to make something other than, 3.5, minutes of content every, 3.5 months released in a windowed environment. You asked about title earlier. I think it's a lot about education. And I think, consumers have a willingness to pay, in some cases, $35 a month for multiple subscription video services. You're really looking at, a third of that cost if people just pick one music platform and derive, all of their listening. And I think, terrestrial broadcast stations will be delivered over these IP channels. We're certainly thinking about it. iHeart has driven a lot of their online or their terrestrial audience to a single app. So, there needs to be a way for artists to make money. And part of that is, legal constraints. And part of it is just like simple kind of education. So
I think part of the education comes from the fact that, like, YouTube, the cat was let out of the bag, but it was let out of the bag to a company that really doesn't care about music much. And I think that's part of the problem. Apple tried it, and RDO and Spotify. Those are music fans that run those companies. Not necessarily the company in Apple's case, but at least the division and the staffing there. And YouTube doesn't really care. It's just boxes on a screen, and they've never really deviated from that. And you can even tell with Music Key and the amount of effort that they've put behind it. It really is not a priority. Part of the education into why you would pay for a streaming subscription is why you should like music in the first place. And that comes from a deep editorial knowledge of what you're actually promoting, which Pandora and RDO and to some extent Apple and others bring to the table, and acknowledgement that music is different than boxes on a screen or a spreadsheet in a software program. And until we kind of get on the product side, music treated differently than just agnostic data, it's going to be hard to kind of educate people. And I like Spotify a lot, and I like what they've done, but I think they've also, in terms of taking the mind share of the streaming thing, have done a disservice to it, because you can actually swap music for photos in Spotify and the UX doesn't need to change. And that's actually a problem on the product side. You can't do that with RDO. You can't do that with Pandora. You can't do that with iTunes to an extent. And so I think we got, there's let's put the cat back in the bag to a degree that we all let out in 2006. And let's put some focus on product and actually make music matter on the product level and differentiate it on the product level, and not just treat it as bits and bytes over the wire.
Yeah, Mark brings up a good point of the disconnect between the habits that families and individuals have of their willingness to pay for video streaming services, but how people view the value of music streaming services. I mean, one change agent for that is family sharing. I think one of the habits that video streaming certainly has in their favor is that a family with a Netflix account, they share that with everyone within the household, right? And I think a lot of the streaming services have started to where it's individual account. If I'm listening on my phone and my daughter goes to log into my Spotify account, then all of a sudden streaming stops on my phone, et cetera. Obviously, they've rolled out family sharing. Jason, what you guys see at Pandora, how important do you think it is for you guys to cross that barrier of this being individual accounts and being more of kind of household family sharing plans?
Trying to think of, I don't know. It's hard to express a company position on that. It's not really how we're set up at the moment. It's, we have our free ad-supported tier, which is a majority of our users. We also have the premium subscription tier, which removes ads and adds some additional features. And I mean, I think just the nature of that arrangement doesn't necessarily need to rely as heavily as something like Netflix, where it's it's all subscription, and it's they when you log in, it's who are you? Are you a kid? Are you this person? And I think our version of that is figuring out the additional ways listeners would want to interact with our service and interact with the music. And an example of that, if we have the two tiers I've outlined so far, the ad-supported and the subscription, perhaps there's variants of that work for different types of consumers. So we've tested things such as ad products, including sponsored listening. So you watch this ad and you get the next hour of listening ad-free. Something like that, where it's sort of a variant on the listening model. We're also evaluating and figuring out the best way to roll out something like a day pass. So perhaps you're having a party, right? Or you want a specific one-time experience without ads. You pay a reduced amount for that, and you get that moment in time as ad-free. So I think just based on our business model and the nature of our product, those are the types of things those are the equivalents, I suppose, of something like a family plan on a different service.
So just to chime in, we love the idea of a family plan, and I've got 3 kids, and I would gladly pay $5 for my kids not to screw up my feed. So I've got very specific music taste, and there's just nothing worse than kind of a Meghan Trainor thing that pops up in the middle of it. So, and it's not even that I'm embarrassed about that. It's just that the more a streaming service knows you, the better they can be at recommending music to you. So, and just to go back to the video thing, I think kids love Netflix. They just typically don't have to pay for it. When I was younger, I got an allowance and I spent it on music, and I think part of it is if adults pay for a unlimited experience on a streaming service, at some point in time, the child, when they have to pay for it themselves, will no longer be satisfied with free. So all of, kids love paid video services, but I think part of it is like just getting that paradigm through. And for us, family plans is like, A, you don't want to corrupt the purity of your account, and B, it is kind of educating. And in a sense, I think it's a bit of a social responsibility for adults to, teach children that art needs to be subsidized. And, and that's a consumer relationship, and it's super affordable these days. It's a lot less expensive to subsidize music than it used to be when you used to have to go make a $15 commitment to, a CD that you might get sick of or might not even like in the first place.
Right. Who do you think ultimately has the best voice to educate? One of the challenges with Tidal is that, they're getting backlash for Beyonce and Madonna saying, look, we're going to get paid. We need paid. And, the bylines have all been, why are rich, multimillionaires complaining about being paid? It's a very tough subject to address. And, labels have tried, artists have tried. Who has the best voice in this? How do we educate young consumers?
I can take a stab at this. When I was putting on my label hat, when I was at the labels, I used to, at first, I would think it would be the services. It's in their business interest. But you realize quickly that anyone with a vested interest, there's a perceived bias as to their interest, which makes sense. It's not to say they can't be a part of it. So then I started thinking, this is something that artists need to take control of. Labels are really not in a position to do so. It's one or two, maybe, just based on such a strong voice and an identity. But for the most part, these days, labels are invisible behind the scenes, right? The artist is the brand. So I worked with artists to ensure that they were speaking to their audience in a way that showed the value of streaming and certainly paying for the music. Now that I'm on the product side, I realize that it's all of the above, that the entire community needs to better unify around a message and a value proposition. And this is the challenge with this is we have 15 years now of 1,000 different arguments and 1,000 different value propositions and 1,000 different general positions on the value and what should be legal and what should be illegal, and what services are worth what and how they contribute. And it makes sense. You have a lot of people that are vested in this with very different positions. But what I've started to realize is that when all of the interests become aligned and the message becomes unified and clear, that's when people can really understand what you're trying to convey. A consumer, particularly, think of a music fan who spends, who's not inside the content, the entertainment industry bubble, who simply goes to work, they have their family, they have their hobbies, and music is a part of their life. They're not really concerned about identifying a value proposition. They simply need to know, is this work within my lifestyle? And is there value? Should I spend? I have limited money to spend. Where do I allocate it? And I think that's the challenge that we are constantly up against, is conveying that value proposition in a way that everyone in that chain agrees upon. And we haven't gotten there yet. I feel like we're getting closer. And a company like Apple, with the reach and impact they have, could certainly make a statement that could be heard and understood. But where it's, as has been said many times over the past 6 months, I feel like more than ever before, the next few years are going to continue to be messy in regards to this. There's still a lot of open discussions about who gets what and how it relates to each other. But as those things start becoming solved, and as big moves and big shifts start to happen like they will this year, I think that conversation starts to be refined.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to putting my label hat on. When an artist would ask, like, how do we get a #1 record? The answer is always, we'll make a good record. So it starts with good product, and it starts with good product on all of the above, like you said. It starts with a good ecosystem of streaming platforms, good ecosystem of, if we're going to still have it, which we will, a la carte download platforms, a good retail chain, good merch chain, good tour promotion, right? All of these things need to drive good product forward in order to actually work together. If you go to the tech business, if you go to next week Collision conference in Vegas, and people start talking about how do we get people to pay for our product, the answer is kind of the same. Make a good product, make something worth paying for, market it appropriately so people understand the value proposition, and be committed to the vision that you set forward with. The problem with the music industry is it's always been, on one side, finger pointing to the reasons why things are going south, and on the other side, finger pointing to the reasons, that they're not the cause of that. So if everybody kind of retreats to their corners and refuses to at least talk, which hasn't really happened in a long time, then everybody's has divergent goals. And we got to get everybody's goal forward, which is making great product for fans in a way that they can get access to and feel that appropriate for paying for, feel that they're getting some value from it. And that's what video gaming and Netflix and everybody else has done. They're marketed around a value proposition to pay for it, from free to play games with DLC, from pay to play games with Xbox Live that still has DLC, that still is a recurring revenue. Like, why do people pay that? Because it's fun, because they get 35 hours of enjoyment from one video game and then can start it again and do it with their friends and then buy something else to make it even more different. So we got to get that degree of focus in the industry.
The good news is that there is tremendous room, right, for growth still. I mean, we're talking about, and we all love, subscription streaming services. But 15 years ago, when the first Napster legal service came out, that was the first streaming service, similar value proposition, maybe a little, number of tracks were probably less back then. But we looked at, when I was at Sony Music, we tracked the subscribers at like 2 million, and it sort of never changed for years. I mean, it was amazing. Churn subscribers were sort of in equilibrium with net additions. And even today, we're still at only 20 million users, and that includes, the ad-supported guys, and I think slightly less than 10 million paid subscribers in the country, where there is, 320 million people. So there's still tremendous growth potential. And Jonathan, you mentioned, the big plans coming up at the development conference. But I think, I believe in partnerships. I think if you can bundle, the subscription, make it look like free, or it's bundled with other products and services, like Amazon Prime has done, or really sort of leverage some of the market power that, the MSOs have and the satellite providers or whoever. I think we're still very much in the beginning of those opportunities, those kind of business development opportunities that would really sort of, I think, project us forward with, penetrating subscribers and getting, people to pay a monthly recurring fee for access to music.
Great. Well, we're coming up on the last 15 minutes here, so I think we'll open up the room to some questions. We'll start with you.
Okay. My name is Brooke Wentz from San Francisco. I deal with rights issues, and I have a new discovery platform. And today on the cover of Digital Music News, it says that Portishead gets 34 million streams, and they'll be making $2,500. My question to the panel is probably more to Mr. Drexler or Mr. Drexler, is when they say this, is RDO or any streaming platform, maybe even Pandora, are you paying for the publishing? Are you paying the PRO rights, or does that come on top of it? And in that case, then, if Portishead gets 34 million streams, what sort of income? And I mean, literally, I'd like to know what numbers they can see from that, because I think that the streaming is a huge issue with artists that are not making any money. And if this is happening, I just want to know what the breakdown is, since we have people here that can actually tell
I think there's, typically there's some misinformation, and you have to be careful with those numbers because, like you mentioned, there's a bunch of different rights holders involved. So I don't even know what sources you were quoting because you didn't tell us, what services they came
Well,
from.
this
But
says it says from Apple, Spotify, it says thank you, Apple, YouTube, and Spotify.
Right.
But just in general, what I want to know is if an artist streams on Pandora or RDO, they make streaming money, they get checks from you guys. Does that include PRO? And if it doesn't include PRO, are we going to see an upsurge in some PRO money? Because if I'm going to deal with an artist, and I'm like, yeah, you guys should go on this streaming site. Oh, you're only going to be making that money. Well, that's fine, but just think of all the PRO money you're
Right.
going to be making.
So again, I think it's a little more complicated because with PROs, we pay the writers and the publishers and not the artists.
Right, okay.
And so there may or may not be the same person. In a lot of cases, you have more than one writers involved. But essentially, you have, streams going to the record labels in subscription services, and you have mechanicals going to the publishers and performance money to the PROs, and then they have their distribution method to pay it out on the back end. And like I said, there's more than just one stakeholder involved. And I think those numbers, you got to be careful. I don't know where they're coming from. I don't know the source of those numbers.
Right, but all I'm saying then is, can you tell me if you get 1 million streams on any platforms, what is the pure money that any writer of any song would be receiving?
So the answer is it fluctuates because it depends on monetization and a couple of other factors. So we don't have a per play payout rate, that goes out to the writers. So it depends on usage. So there's a bunch of factors that, are in between sort of figuring out how much a per play fee is at the end of the day. But also looking at this, how many streams do you need to make up for a lost to download dollar is questionable, right? I think it's more healthy to look at it from like an ARPU perspective when you replace recurring revenue and you bring people up to paying recurring revenue every month that have maybe bought 2 or 3 records before or have spent no money on music. You'll see that's the real upside I think we need to be looking at. It's a scale proposition.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have too much to add except that, we have set rates that we pay. And we pay them to the majors, we pay them through distributors, independent distributors. So, but what's increasingly kind of frustrating and saddening to me is that, the history of how artists get paid is a long and horrible road. Since the beginning, artists have not negotiated well for themselves. And when you read something like that, I don't know what the label economics were for Portishead. I don't know what the publishing rights look like. For us, it's not, and I think there's also a misnomer in the industry that, we have these faceless streaming companies and, they're making tons of money. I mean, the reality is we run a retail business. So we have a basically 30% gross margin business. We don't run a 70% gross margin software business like Google or Uber or pick a company. So, again, those numbers for certain people, and Portishead's had many singers. There's different kind of DJs. They have sample rights. So I think you have to unpack those numbers a little bit. And again, it's not, each artist has different economics, and some of those deals were bad deals. Right. And these artists are, kind of living with the repercussions. Some artists own all their rights, own, the publishing rights and the distribution rights. So I think, I think there's a lot of misconception when you read a number like that. I love Portishead. I wish they could make more money. I wish I was sitting next to them when they negotiated their, deals. I wish, they didn't overpay for the samples that they use. But I think you have to kind of pick below the numbers because there's no answer.
He does say underneath, especially, thank you, Apple, YouTube, Spotify, especially UMG News for selling our music so cheaply.
Well, the thing about the stories like that are a disservice to not only the artist, the label, the PRO, and the streaming service. No one held a gun to Portishead's head when they went on a deal signing, right? When they had the stack of papers about this long in the conference room at UMG, and there was champagne popped. There was no guns held to people's heads. Get a better lawyer, negotiate better rights, pay more attention to who you're paying out to when you do a song and how you split your songwriters' royalties. Own your own publishing. Do what U2, REM, Pearl Jam, all the big guys did. Buy your masters back when you can. Like, it's a business in the end, and it's no different if you're an artist than if you're RDO or Apple or UMG or BMI. It's still, looking out for your own rights and trying to make good stuff and have a good lawyer negotiate a good deal on both sides of the table.
You have to add too, they're talking strictly about streaming. The sad part is they're not bringing radio plays into effect there. And what did they get out of radio plays? I mean, it's substantially less because they're not paying for the performance rights. So, I mean, I think we need to put it all together on where do people listen to music? Where do they find music? It's this whole group of things that are giving it. So I think that's sort of an unfair article. And I've seen a lot of those and I feel like they pick on streaming.
that outlet publishes one about once a month.
Yeah.
Because they're good for getting attention, and it's little numbers with big bands, but if you unpack it, it's not a music service, it's a music business. And a business is an ecosystem of players. So it doesn't mention that the streaming revenue may have been low because if it was free tier, but it drove up their tour revenue, for instance.
Should Tidal have waited until they negotiated Sony's rights? They didn't have any Sony rights at all for the music catalog. And would that have also hurt their download sales or just anything else for them? And I know it took a lot of time before certain things like Spotify got set up and got into the marketplace. And one of the reasons why was they wanted to have all the best catalogs to give the public the best choice. And I think that could have been one of the reasons why Tidal has been a disaster, is that why would I pay for that? If I can't even get your wife, Beyonce's on, you can't even give me your wife's music. So why would I pay you $10 for it?
I think Tidal is an example of many things going wrong besides their rights picture. Is how not to launch a streaming platform basically in one press conference. And I think people saw through how cynical of a play it is, and it was super transparent. I mean, Jay runs Rock Nation, co-owned by Live Nation, who Jimmy Iovine's on the board of. It's not hard to unpack the motivations there. I don't think if they had 35 million songs or 1,000 of the top 100, from the last year, it would have made any difference.
Yes.
I have a question about how much business you see in the long tail phenomena. Some people said that the recommendations actually not working because of, you don't discover music, it's so segmented. So you want to be able to discover artists that you haven't seen. So content-based recommendation system, you see that as something that seems to be business?
I don't know. For us, it's kind of, we're trying to help people break the paradigm of 35 million songs and nothing to listen to. So for most of the history of recorded music, you were programmed to, whether it was at the record store and that was the CD that was sitting on the aisle, whether it's the DJ, playing the same song once an hour, for 3 weeks. I mean, I think the more people start to use these services, the more these services can actually leverage and recommend deeper parts of the catalog. It's hard, it's hard to break through the first layer of music, but I think that's part of what will happen over time. The long tail will become more important. Our platform happens to be, super kind of lean forward on independent artists and up and coming artists, and the data that we see around artists that will eventually break. I mean, we were kind of looking at play data based on, set times at Coachella and things like that. It kind of depends on how you use the services. If you just go to new releases on Tuesday, you will have a filtered view of what's out there. If you start to look at the data that we provide for you in a home feed, you're gonna start to unpack 35 million songs. So again, it's each of these platforms will have a front door that either enables and encourages discovery, or largely is just a different kind of retail environment than the one that existed 25 years ago.
I think music's a complicated thing to talk about in terms of discovery and long tail because it means so many things to so many people. For most people, it's wallpaper. It's something in the background, and it could be the same top 40 playlist that just evolves year over year, and that's all they really listen to. And maybe the year you graduated college or high school, it cements itself in your nostalgia kind of node of your brain.
Taste freeze.
Taste freeze. Yeah. I think that's a good name for it.
Jim Lucchese from Echo Nest coined the phrase, I believe.
I like it. But for others, it does warrant deep involvement. And I think streaming's really, a great thing for long tail because you can start associating the long tail music curation with other forms of media online, especially as we get to the BuzzFeedification, which I'm coining, of content, where it's all around, mashing up different contexts of things in terms of lists and memes and all that good stuff. So you see a lot on if you go to Reddit, there's forums dedicated to Spotify playlists that also have a version for RDO and a version for this. And those are actually pretty cool because you can just subscribe to like the top 100 most beautiful songs from 2000 on up. And it's, fan curated on every platform, and super deep. And I subscribe to a ton of those that I just found, stumbling through Reddit. So I think that, you're democratizing access because of streaming, but at the same time, most people really don't care. And that's always that music discovery problem.
And,
Well, but just to unpack the taste freeze thing, Lucchese, on a panel a couple of years ago, he said, look, there's this paradigm, there's this, I think he called it an affliction, or maybe I call it an affliction, called taste freeze. And, people stop leaning forward and discovering music when they're, 25 or something like that. But when you survey those people, are they satisfied with that condition? 90% of them say no. Like, I wish I was discovering, REM or whatever it was that they discovered back in the day. So I agree. I think there is a lot of passive lean back consumption, but I don't necessarily think it's just kind of the way that it is. It's not necessarily the way that people want it to be. And I think if you had an easier way to lean back and discover music, and which is why Pandora is so great.
Yeah.
For me, the thing about Pandora that's strange is that when Pandora really works, you have to leave and go somewhere else. But that, that is the magic of Pandora. It turns you on to something without having to work very hard. But I don't know.
yeah, I mean, long tail and middle tier is a huge part of what we do. I mean, I believe it's over 80% of artists on Pandora are not getting airplay on any other push format, terrestrial radio, something like that, where it's pushed to them in the name of discovery. So we have artists, tens of thousands, 100,000 artists being played, getting heard to the tune, some in the millions, tens of millions of spins that would have no other avenue to be discovered. So, and this is not just unique to us, but at our scale, we're certainly leading that charge. And I think that's a benefit of streaming in general, but it's even more so a benefit of the type of product. Certain products, as we've discussed, you need to know what you're looking for, and discovery is minimal. There's others where you hit play, and based on what information you give it, an experience is tailored to you. And of course, the head of the tail, the top 1%, is a huge percentage of plays. And of course, Beyonce and Drake and those artists get tremendous airplay with us. But one of the things that I've really enjoyed in my artist marketing role is getting to talk to these long tail artists that basically say, you are the #1 driver of new fans for us. And it may be 5,000 new fans, or it might be 500,000 new fans. Of course, mileage varies, but this is something that we and a few others like us can bring to the table that have reintroduced awareness of long tail when it was, when many of those artists and genres were starting to fade into obscurity.
Sorry, the gentleman in the blue shirt, I saw your hand earlier.
Just talk some more about up-and-coming new artists and like at Pandora or the other guys. How are you, mix them into like for example, Ben Howard, you guys discovered City in Color that never knew about. But talk about how you're strategically new artists, up-and-coming artists in your feeds, and is there some formulaic stuff on Pandora with Janelle or Mario? Talk about how that works.
So at Pandora, there's a number of ways that can happen, right? We have a team of curators that are expert music fans, essentially. A lot of them were previously buyers at retail chains, radio programmers, people who really understand music and artistry, and they specialize in genres typically. And they're sort of the gatekeepers in a sense of, we are a subset of the celestial catalog, right? The 35 million rough catalog, we're about 1.5 million of that because we're not playing everything. So a song or songs, an album gets pulled in, it's analyzed by our expert musicologists, many of which are PhDs in music theory and similar, almost all of them working musicians, or certainly many. And hundreds of attributes are assigned to these songs. And through that, it gets fed into the algorithm, which then, based on a whole lot of secret sauce, starts marrying up songs and artists based on all these different attributes. And so what starts to happen from that, of course, is artists that you are likely to be interested in if only you knew about them surface. But then there's user feedback, right? Thumbs up, thumbs down, things like that, skips, where that has an impact on how how often and how fast a song is attached to other artists, how often it's heard in that context. But there's also human programming. We have genre stations that artists get added to, again, based on that expert understanding. So you add all of this up, and what you get is this ecosystem where songs can enter, and they have multiple ways they can be discovered. And then based on user feedback and the secret sauce, the algorithm, they either ramp up and are continued to be discovered and snowball into something bigger, or they settle into their place, and that's where they live, you know, at varying levels of discovery. So it's a really interesting process to get to watch and to get to look at data on, because again, we see artists that have no traction elsewhere or very, very little, that due to the nature of all these inputs and levers end up building an audience within our system.
Yeah, I mean, just from audio standpoint, we have 3 flavors of curation. So we have algorithms, and so albums, songs, artist-based stations. And sometimes songs will start a different station than albums and or artists, because that song will have different attributes. We also have curators, so we build stations and playlists, and we have actual human beings who love music and can go deep on any category. And then we actually have an editorial team that works with labels to surface new music across every genre. And, you know, we have a feed-based metaphor, and there's 25 different stories in that feed. And all of those stories are basically built around discovery. So it's things folks in your network are looking at, it's new releases, it's stations people are listening to, it's, you know, so we kind of throw a bunch of different flavors towards discovery, and each of these different starting points will, you know, kind of turn you in a different direction.
So look, we have time for a couple of questions. If we keep it brief here, I know the lady here had a question. I'll let you go.
Oh, great, thank you. You guys touched on the world of analytics and Big Champagne. I know Ethan a little bit about what you were doing at Live Nation, and we have a social analytics platform. But my big question is where do you see the biggest opportunity in analytics, and in the scheme of things of everything you have to do in this world of discovery and delivery and everything, how important is it?
I think it's, you know, as we get to a subscription model, it's going to become a lot more embargoed data into each provider, because the subscription services are retail services that have to pay attention to churn and lifetime value and ARPU and all of the stuff that a normal subscription service has to pay attention to. All that data is going to be locked up. The real meat of it is locked up within each provider. And sadly, you know, Big Champagne's no more. So there's really no aggregator of that out there. So I think there is potential for a market for that, especially as we move into a subscription-based model, and knowing the customer, minimizing churn, minimizing activation costs, and maximizing things like referring and retention are going to be important.
The sad fact about analytics, it's hugely important, but when you think about something like marketing analytics, there are literally hundreds of thousands of customers for that data. There's not very many customers for music analytic data, which is, you know, one of the reasons why there aren't many of these companies. So there aren't a lot of customers, and if there aren't a lot of customers, you know, the prices will either be artificially high or not high at all. So you know, data is super important, but in different industries, it's you know, there are a lot more, there's a lot more demand, and the price is a lot less elastic.
I think it's really important for the artists themselves to actually see the data, and it can basically give them and help them make informative decisions about what they're going to do next. I also think like radio stations should be paying attention to this. And we were talking about this earlier, where this shows you what is relevant. If you see the data and you see that in specific areas, or you see that a new talent is emerging that might not be on the charts yet, these are things that radio stations, anyone who wants to be relevant with their audience, should be looking at and leveraging to do a better job to keep their fan bases. And then, of course, the artists themselves.
To Ethan's point again, there is definitely, I think, opportunities for new entrants in the marketplace. I mean, data analytics is not just used for marketing. It's also used, obviously, to pay rights holders, for example. And so there's all these silos today where, I mean, all the data exists, but there's nobody has really connected the dots yet. I mean, this is tremendous. I mean, I think this is like this is where the value, I think, is coming from, is data analytics. I mean, that's the core of this business.
So we're being asked to wrap it up. So what I'll do is I'll do one last question here, the gentleman in the red shirt, and I'll just ask that one person takes the answer on this, and then we'll adjourn. So.
Yeah, among the many hats that I wear, I'm also a DJ. I've been a DJ for a long time, and what's interesting to me now, when I go out into the world and go to a record store and put my money down and the counter and get my records, is that my workflow is I will go to my streaming service and I will find all the music that I've been listening to throughout the week while I've been working, and when I have a gig, then I go on. I have literally 2 computers, and I go on to iTunes or Beatport or whatever these sites are to purchase the hard copy in order to play it out. Is there in the future, any possibility that it will be a more streamlined experience for DJs that are playing this music out to be able to basically just buy a playlist off of one of your streaming services? Is that even a possibility?
Buy a playlist. Well, we're rolling out a mobile product that allows for some set number of, so it depends on, there are different rights associated with different platforms. So on mobile, you can effectively do that. On web, you can't. These are label restrictions, not our restrictions. So a lot of it is, a lot of it is how the kind of rights are negotiated on a going forward basis. That's a strange logistical thing. If you were to DJ on 2 mobile devices, like you wouldn't need to purchase the tracks, but if you want to DJ off of 2 laptops.
DJ rent their set list for the, stuff like that is like what I'm thinking about. There's also like record pools where you would just go and you just have all the stuff and you just subscribe and you just have it. But I'm just curious to see like how that, how streaming and like
Yeah,
Just thinking what the
look,
BizDev meeting at a
I'm going to
record
jump in
label
here.
look like to have that discussion.
I was going to tell you to go build it, but yeah, you might want to think twice.
Yeah, you'll end up in Rockefeller Center at some point, and that'll be very uncomfortable.
Looks good.
Look, thank you guys. Please show your appreciation for everyone up here. Guys, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.